Okay, right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak. It's been an interesting week. I've managed to dip in and out of the sessions virtually. I realise that we're at the end of the sessions almost, so I'm going to try and keep things brief, but unfortunately I'm going to be covering quite a lot of ground. So I'm going to follow on from Julia's talk. I'm going to focus more specifically on some of the research results that we actually found and talk a little bit more about the recommendations, and talk about specifically what we found in relation to prevalence, what we found in relation to platforms, impacts and vulnerability, and identify some of the knowledge gaps and make some recommendations as we go. So I just want to start by making a couple of brief comments about methodology, not too much heavy going on a Friday afternoon. The primary focus of the review was on online sexual risks and harm. So we were specifically looking at peer-to-peer sexual exploitation involving young people themselves. So that was focusing on online sexual harassment. So that's things like sexual bullying, sexual gossip, etc., etc. And a sub kind of component of online sexual harassment for young people is intimate image abuse. So we were interested in young people taking and sharing sexual images of other young people non-consensually. And the second half of the review, if you like, focused on what you might call adult to child sexual exploitation. So we're interested in what we call technology assisted child sex abuse. Other people will call it online sexual exploitation, and that's essentially where offenders use technology to sexually exploit a child or perhaps to facilitate offline sexual abuse of a child. And then the final category was CSAM, so child sexual abuse material. And so what we wanted to do was to have a look at what the current evidence base told us, what the knowledge gaps were, and to make some recommendations on how to address them. And what we did for those 4 categories of online sexual risk was we used a modified rapid evidence assessment methodology. We used a systematic and structured search strategy for each of those 4 categories. We looked at the, primarily we started with the UK academic literature published since 2017. We didn't actually find so much in those particular 4 categories, so we expanded our reach, if you like, to non-academic, to non-UK research. And we also looked at relevant Brace literature searches. And then just to make it much more complicated and much more broad-ranging, we did a light touch review of other online risks, so the primary, priority and priority content in the Online Safety Act. And we also wanted to look at the design features and technical tools that can reduce or increase exposure to risk and harm. And for that, we just really looked at a review of reviews. So we found literature reviews that had looked at those 2 areas and summarised what the key state of the art was. And then we used those as the basis for some more limited, I would say, searches of the grey and academic literature. So just to give a quick overview of the general conclusion that we took away from looking at all of the literature, what we found was that actually, quite surprisingly, the UK evidence base, particularly in relation to online sexual risk and harm, hadn't developed significantly since 2017. It was different for some of the other risk categories that we looked at, a lot more research being done perhaps in relation to cyberbullying, for example. And what we found, again, particularly in relation to sexual harm, sexual risk and harm, was that what was available was quite fragmented. And it was quite difficult to interpret some of the results and to compare them between studies because of some of the methodological issues that are common in these different research areas. I will touch on some of those as we move forward. So one of the things that we concluded was quite difficult to try and get a clear understanding of what the current landscape of risk and harm for UK children was. And to make any clear sort of comparisons with 2017 to see how things had changed. It does give us some baseline understanding. And as Julia said, one of the things we wanted to do with this was to try and get that baseline understanding so that we can see how things change over time in the future and assess the impact of the Online Safety Act. So what I'm going to do now is to move on to talk about some of these areas more specifically. So in terms of prevalence, we wanted to look at prevalence because obviously that is a key area of interest to policymakers, civil society, etc. It's also very important for research. And what we found was that in terms of the scale of children's exposure to sexual risk and harm, there were variations between studies and between different risk categories. So what I've included there is the prevalence ranges, if you like, that we identified in the literature that we looked at for the review. So you can see that in terms of online sexual harassment, for example, so that's involving peers, we found quite a broad range of prevalence figures reported in the literature between 8 and 26%. In terms of adults, trying to engage with children sexually online and to interact with them sexually, we found lower levels of prevalence. So for sexual solicitation, 7 to 18% was reported in the studies, and for sexual interactions with adults, a lower proportion of 5 to 8%. In terms of intimate image abuse involving peers, we found kind of a similar proportion of 3 to 8%. And what we found was that the proportions for some of the other risk categories were higher in terms of prevalence. So, for example, exposure to sexual content and hate-related content. So what we found was that if we took an upper limit on the end of the different prevalences, up to 25% of children had been exposed to some form of online sexual risk, but this was, as I said, less frequent than some of the other risks that we covered with the review. So in terms of knowledge gap, what we identified was that we had less evidence about how prevalence varies across different groups of children, and I'm going to come on to this again in a couple of slides' time. We have less understanding of how it changes over time. And as Julia said, longitudinal research in this area is going to be very important. And another key issue around having good measures of prevalence is that, of course, prevalence is an important variable if we are going to try and examine that relationship between exposure to risk and the experience of harm that Julia mentioned as being very important. We know that not all children exposed to risk subsequently experience harm, and we need very good kind of prevalence measures so that we can develop more complicated designs which use more complex statistical modelling to look at the relationship between risk and harm more effectively. In terms of platforms, as it's important to know how prevalent exposure to different types of risk and the experience of harm are, but we actually also really need to know how frequently this happens on different platforms. And strangely, what we found is that there's not much available research which addresses where children experience risk and harm. Majority of self-report studies with children ask about platform usage, so it will ask how frequently they use Instagram, Facebook, etc., but it doesn't necessarily ask where they are experiencing risks, where they're experiencing harm. The available evidence that is out there suggests that, as you would expect, the main platforms that are popular with children are the location of exposure to sexual and other types of risk and harm, so Snapchat, Instagram, etc. And this kind of triangulates with the data that we get from agencies like the IWF and NetMec and platform transparency reports about the amount of sexual risk and harm that's being reported or detected on their platforms. A key thing, obviously, that has changed since 2017 is that live streaming has become much more common. And we are seeing live streaming and first-person produced sexual imagery by children as being increasingly involved in the production and distribution of CSAM, and being involved in other forms of sexual exploitation as well. So in terms of the knowledge gaps that we identified, we need to have more detail about the prevalence of sexual risk and harm in particular on different platforms. This includes particularly those platforms like WhatsApp, which use end-to-end encryption, where the use of detection tools for online sexual exploitation and CSAM is relatively limited. We also don't know very much about exposure to sexual risk and harm in online gaming environments, despite the fact that for many years now they've been very popular amongst children. We really don't have a good idea of what happens within those environments in terms of sexual risk and harm. And coming back to the rise of live streaming, obviously what we need to know more about is how grooming processes will operate in these channels. And if you think about situations where perhaps live streaming might involve multiple perpetrators as an active audience, where they may be directing a young person or a child to engage in sexually abusive activities, we really don't know very much about the dynamics of how those processes work. So that's obviously another key area of research moving forward. And another thing to note in relation to platforms is that, okay, where we have data that tells us something about prevalence of risk and harm on different platforms, what we need to understand is why it is happening on those particular platforms. And that comes back to one of the research questions that we had about understanding how risk and harm, exposure to risk and experience of harm is related to platform design features, things like algorithms, how contacts are made, age assurance, reporting tools, all of those types of things, as well as to see how the existing design features can also be used to potentially disrupt, for example, sexual interactions between adults and children, or those initial contacts, perhaps. So moving on to the final key area that I want to focus on, which is impacts and vulnerability. So in terms of impacts, again, the research literature in relation to this for sexual risk and harm hasn't really developed in the UK since 2017. There's been a couple of notable exceptions in terms of studies, and that will reflect those ethical and safeguarding challenges that are associated with working around such a sensitive topic, perhaps trying to work with young people who've been victimized in this way, how to kind of protect them if they will engage with the research process. However, the available evidence that we do have does suggest that victimization, whether it involves adults or peers, does have significant and negative and long-term impacts on children's emotional, psychological and social well-being. So there is evidence of high levels of anxiety and depression resulting from sexual harm online, the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder. For peer-related sexual harassment and intimate image abuse, we see quite a lot of social exclusion, bullying and reputational damage, as well as those kind of more emotional psychological impacts. And of course, we know that the impacts that young people experience in these kind of victimization situations can be intensified by the technological features of the online environment. So that is things to do with the persistence of imagery online, the difficulties of preventing ongoing dissemination. And we know from victims that that is a really big concern for them, and it really is a barrier of sort of trying to sort of navigate the outcomes of their victimization experiences. So we do need to develop more of an evidence base in the UK of different impacts associated with different forms of sexual harm. That will help us to develop more effective support processes for young people who have been victimized. It will also help us to develop more understanding of those specific factors which increase the vulnerability of specific children or groups of children to online risk exposure and the experience of harm. In terms of what we currently know in terms of vulnerability to online risks, and it's quite interesting, is that vulnerability has been talked about in the online safety space for many, many years now, and we all agree that it's a really important issue that we need to understand more about. But actually, it's quite surprising when you look at the literature that since 2017, the research evidence is still quite patchy in this area. The main focus of research has been on gender and age, and the more recent research is consistent with earlier research findings. So we know, for example, that girls are more likely to encounter online sexual risks in particular and experience harm more frequently than boys, which is, of course, not to minimise any victimisation of boys that does happen, but there is evidence that it does seem to more be experienced by girls. In relation to online sexual harassment and intimate image abuse, we know that there are gendered contexts in which those forms of victimisation happen, and that the judgments that are made of girls who experience intimate image abuse are quite different to that of boys, and that can intensify the severity of impacts for girls. In terms of age, no surprise there. We know that older adolescents are more likely to report all types of online risk exposure and harm, and that this is the case for online sexual harassment, intimate image abuse, and online sexual exploitation by adults. The notable exception there, I guess, is the evidence that we have from organisations such as the IWF that show us that younger children are more commonly depicted in CSAM. And that's kind of a gap that we have in the literature, in that it's very difficult to try and talk to younger children about perhaps getting requests from adults to send sexual pictures, to find effective ways and appropriate ways to ask questions about that. So that's something else that I think we need to look at in the future. The knowledge gaps in relation to vulnerability, if you like, are really about that broader set of demographic, psychological, social and environmental factors that can influence young people's risk exposure and the harm that comes from that. So that can be a whole range of variables, including existing mental health difficulties, lack of parental support, the role of the peer group. There's a huge amount of variables that potentially can impact that relationship between the experience of risk and the subsequent experience of harm. And we really need to be able to have more complicated research designs that can look at a broader set of vulnerability characteristics in combination, and not just look at a small set of vulnerability characteristics individually or as or in combination. So we need to take a much broader approach to looking at vulnerability. We also need to think about how young people who may be vulnerable in the online environment, they may experience online risk and harm, the extent to which you might well expect them to be vulnerable and exposed to risks and harm in the offline environment. So what we might call poly-victimization, how those vulnerability factors in a child's life might lead to them being exploited online and offline. And of course, that will have a sort of a cumulative effect on the harm that's experienced and the psychological and the social impacts that are related to that. And getting more evidence, more robust evidence in this area is important, so that we can think about developing targeted educational interventions for particular groups of vulnerable children, perhaps, as well as supporting young people who do experience online victimization. And if we can do some more research, both quantitative and qualitative, with young people who have been victimized, we can learn more about how platform features actually combine with vulnerability to perhaps increase that likelihood of exposure to risk turning into sexual harm. And that has great benefits for understanding platform design, for thinking about the inclusivity and responsiveness of technical tools, thinking about age assurance, for example, and how we can make sure that we have the online environment set up in as best a way to meet the needs of different groups of young people, some of whom will be very vulnerable to risk and harm. So how am I doing for time? Not sure with time. lost my... 15 minutes. Have I got 5 minutes?
You have. You've got 10.
Oh, I've gone too quickly. That's the thing of going too fast, you see. Okay, so I know I've just been through a lot of different areas of research that the review looked at. I've identified a lot of knowledge gaps that we've got. And what I'm going to do now with this slide is try to bring some of those together to think about the type of research recommendations that we made in the report, the things that we think are important in developing a more robust evidence base in the UK, but more broadly. So one of the key things that we found when we looked at individual studies was the variety of different research designs, different definitions that are used of the same type of forms of online risk, so sexual risk, for example, the different types of measures that are used of those different types of online risk and harmful experiences, and the different sampling strategies that are used. So some studies use representative sampling, most studies use opportunity sampling, and so there's a lack of standardization in lots of the research that we have a look at, and that makes it quite difficult to try and compare the results of different studies. So one of our key recommendations was to increase the comparability of research results by trying to bring in some greater standardization of research definitions, measures, and the types of sampling strategies that are used, which will then hopefully give us more ability to compare the results of different studies. One of the key things that we noted is that in some studies that look at online sexual risk and harm, they don't necessarily make clear distinctions between the involvement of adults or peers as perpetrators, or where peers are involved between consensual and non-consensual online sexual interactions. So we need to get some more fine-grained measures being used there so that we actually have a clearer view of the prevalence of online sexual risk exposure. And that's important when we want to look at that as a predictor of the experience of harm and the psychological impacts that I outlined before. Another recommendation that we made was, as I alluded to before, the need to go bigger with our research designs. We need to measure a broader set of variables that are associated with online risk and harm. Prevalence is one, the involved platforms is another. The intensity and the impact of the associated harms is also something that we need to look at in more detail. And we need to incorporate a broad set of vulnerability factors. I think also one thing that we don't tend to talk about too much is the role of protective factors. So obviously that's something that can be incorporated into more complex research designs. And having that broader set of variables in research designs, combined with trying to use more longitudinal designs, will allow us to develop more complex statistical analyses of data that will allow us to have a look at the relationship between these different variables, so between risk, vulnerability, and impacts over time. It will allow us to have a look at the processes by which being exposed to risk online leads to harm and which groups of children that happens for. And that will then enable us to inform better prevention and response activities. And it goes without saying that if you ask an academic about what is needed in relation to any area of research, they will A, say more research, B, they will also say more research funding. And as Julia said, it's actually quite difficult to get long-term and sustained research funding to look at online risk and harm. And that is a really significant problem in the UK if we want to build up that clearer picture of the landscape of risk and harm for children, so that we can look at changes over time. We can track things like the impact of the Online Safety Act. So last slide now is just trying to bring some of those thoughts together. So our research recommendations effectively are aimed towards developing this more robust evidence base so that we have an improved understanding of children's exposure to online risk and the resulting harm, that we can identify specific groups of children who may be more vulnerable to risk and harm, and to think about the type of preventative educational measures and other things we might put in place to try and minimise risk exposure and harm, but also in terms of how we actually develop support systems for those who have unfortunately been victimised. Developing a more robust evidence base using more complicated designs, a broader set of variables, longitudinal designs will actually give us greater consistency between evidence and policy. It will allow us to have that baseline measure against which we can look at those changes over time and the impact of the Online Safety Act and however things develop in the future, because obviously there's a lot of time, effort, resources that will be put into the new regulatory regime, and it's very important to be able to see how that has an impact on the everyday experiences of children. Getting a more robust evidence base will also help platforms and people who work in the safety tech sort of sectors, age assurance, to develop solutions that are more, again, fitted to the everyday experiences of children and young people. And it can also inform more effective prevention and response actions by other stakeholders. So that includes schools, the education system, police and enforcement, as well as practitioners who work for young people. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I know I've whizzed through a lot of information, but the process of doing the review itself was huge. I felt like I'd done another PhD by the time that I finished. So that brings me to the end, and I'm very happy to take questions, and hopefully Julia will also be available as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Actually, we should call you Doctor now, because you've done a second PhD, haven't you?
Thank you.
I mean, just on that point about research and the need for more research money, I completely get that and completely understand that. Sometimes we worry, or I worry anyway, that we have to wait until we have the nth degree of certainty about everything before we do something. Yeah. And it's certainly often said by the industry that we don't understand this problem well enough, and that's a reason for not acting. And I appreciate acting without full knowledge can lead to unintended consequences, but so can not acting. Andy, go ahead.
Cheers. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Julia. It's Andy Burrs here from the Molly Rose Foundation. I think three things stood out for me when I was reflecting on what you were talking about there. Firstly, high quality peer-reviewed academic research takes time. Yeah. But even saying that, it's staggering to hear that the evidence base on CSA hasn't moved markedly since 2017, which was, about the time that we were starting to see personalized algorithmic recommendations on platforms. It just feels extraordinary. Secondly, the kind of landscape around knowledge production, there's a set of dynamics around, industry granting preferential access to sympathetic researchers, or that being a mechanism for funding and an attempt to skew the evidence base. So a kind of set of moral hazards there. And thirdly, Ofcom, for better or worse, taking a very, very high, establishing a very high threshold around evidence before it will, identify harms or recommend measures to tackle them in its regulatory scheme. With all of those three things being true, how do we square those various circles?
Do you want me to go first, Joe?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Andy, for an easy question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think, I think absolutely, completely agree with you. And I've been thinking about this actually, and what the answer is. We absolutely need an evidence base. It's actually of no surprise to me that there hasn't been much research around online child sexual abuse since 2017. because as somebody who's regularly in the position of trying to raise funding to continue that work, it's incredibly difficult to do so because so few funders are willing to fund this area. I mean, that's the bottom line, unfortunately, here. So, yeah, and I hear what you're saying about Ofcom. I do think there needs to be an independently established research fund, probably set up by UKRI. You know, so we could all have access to that. We could all put in bids independently of Ofcom, of industry, of the government. I do believe there needs to be an independent research fund, substantial research fund. And I think that's the only way forward in terms of constructing a decent evidence base here.
Is Mr. Studzinski,
Yeah.
your question on it?
My question, thank you both for the very detailed presentation. My question is a methodological one, and I link to the knowledge gap that you identified, that the relationship between risk exposure and experience of harm is not really clear. And I was wondering, what would be then the advantage of taking a risk-oriented approach rather than a experience-oriented approach if we research this?
Do you want to go first, Joe?
I'm afraid my brain's died, Julia. To be perfectly honest, my brain's died.
So I think it's not a question of taking either a risk-based approach or a harms-based approach. I mean, what we've tended to do in our research in the past is just to think about, you know, it's been very much focused on a particular issue. So, for example, and that's largely been driven, I have to say, by the particular funder that we're working for at the time. You know, it's not the case generally that we have carte blanche in terms of setting the research agenda as researchers. I mean, this is another frustration for us. Unless you're submitting a bid to UKRI, and for Joe and I, that would be the Economic and Social Research Council, where you can submit an open bid, you know, one that focuses specifically on what you would like to focus on and where you think the need is. It is unfortunately the case, as you know, I'm not sure if you're working in research context as well, but it is unfortunately the case that the research agenda is set by funders. And it's often a political agenda, as we know, and so we don't really have much choice. So you answer a call, essentially. You answer a call, and the funder sets the parameters around that. So you know, sometimes there's a bit of room for negotiation, but in my experience, there isn't, and I think that's really problematic. But I don't see a way around that. So, you know, I'm not sure, Joe, that's your experience as well, I'm sure.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, in terms of explaining why there's a lack of research in relation to CSA, for example, because you simply don't see the calls, and because many calls are set like that, there's very little leeway of where to go with it.